Today, this is the first of the second cycle. We're following the Seven Stories textbook here. So the initial cycle that we just completed was really looking at methodology and the tools that we use to understand the text. But now we're gonna actually start the studies proper. And so this cycle is the first of the seven stories. It's called Oppression to Justice. And it's really a study of the beginning of the Bible story. And most people think, well, that should be Genesis, right? But what we're looking for is the beginning of the actual God's sort of interaction with the people, where it all began. And that was the Exodus experience. So Genesis it is the prehistories, and it's a reflection on where we come from, where human beings came from, and what the problems of, that arose, what the problems of being human are, and what the solutions. But that was a later development, and although it chronologically, of course, it's occurs, all those events would occur before Exodus, the actual foundational experience of the Jewish people, the Israelites, the people of God, of Yahweh, was the Exodus experience. And so that's where the seven stories begins. And then the way the cycle's gonna go, it's made up of 3 weekly lessons. And today we're going to be looking at something called the Hapiru, and I'll explain that in a minute. It's really the group of people that God decides to um, reveal himself or herself to right at the beginning. That's the Hapiru. And then next week we will focus on the story of the Exodus. And then the third lesson in this first story is how Jesus reinterprets the events of the Exodus and the teachings of the Ten Commandments in his Sermon on the Mount. So that's kind of how the structure of the next 3 weeks is going to go. So the Hapiru, this is really to the main point of this part of the lesson is to show that the text reveals that when God, through Moses, calls a people out of slavery into the wilderness, across the Red Sea into the wilderness and then into the land, he's not calling a racial group, an ethnic group. He's actually calling a socioeconomic class of people, a socioeconomic group of people, the poor, the dispossessed, the people who are sort of classless almost. And you might think, well, why does that matter? Well, it kind of matters quite a lot. And we'll have more of that discussion later on, because it's a very different kind of agenda if God is calling a group of people based on their poverty and their they're living on the fringes, dispossessed, that they have nothing, to a group of people that have an ethnic and racial identity because they are the descendants of a certain person and they belong to the same clan. It's a very different kind of approach to looking at that initial foundational experience. We're going to get more into that as we go along with this lesson, and it will hopefully become a bit clearer. But there's this word called Hapiru. And well, I'll just read what my notes here because I'm floundering a little bit. Sorry about that. So Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, tells the story of the patriarchs, and the first of the patriarchs is Abraham. Um, if you think of the book of Genesis, you have the first 11 chapters, which are all about, Adam and Eve. They're all semi-mythical kind of stories that they're called the prehistories. But then at chapter 12, you get God calling a specific person, and that person was Abraham. And then the rest of Genesis is talks about the stories of Abraham, Abraham's son, you know, there's Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob's sons, the 12 sons that become the leaders of the 12 tribes, including Joseph. And Genesis ends with the story of Joseph. And then at the end of the book of Joseph, Genesis at the end, when he's talking about Joseph, if you remember, he helps Pharaoh, and then he brings his father and his brothers into Egypt. And then the segue between Genesis and the next book, which is Exodus, is that after many, many years, uh, the descendants of Joseph and the tribes of, Jacob, the sons of Jacob, became slaves in Egypt. And then those were the slaves, and the descendants of the slaves were the group of people that Moses then brings out of slavery um, uh, in the Exodus. So that's a way to sort of make it seamlessly an ethnic, racial, familial group that was led out from Egypt, right? So that's where we get that from. Um, but Genesis, as I said before, Genesis was actually compiled much later than the story of the book of Exodus. Genesis was probably put together at the time of the exile, or, and it was more of a reflection on the Exodus. It's like so if we think of Exodus as the true origin story of the Bible, it's the foundational event, and that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were sort of semi-legendary figures. Probably they were existing stories, ancestor stories that were existed um, among that group, but they were expanded and sort of tacked on to the beginning of the story. But what we're looking at today is how the Exodus experience, which formed the group and made them a people, was not from the genetic descent, but it was actually the event itself that formed the people. So in the book of Exodus, we see that the people who are called out from Egypt are defined primarily by oppression and not by racial descent. Um, and the reason we know this is that they were given, and early on, the name that was given to this group was the Hebrews. Later, the word that's mostly associated with the people who settled in the land, the promised land, would be Israelites, because the word for Jacob was Israel. Israel comes from the name that God gave Jacob. He said, "You will be called Israel from now on."
Mm.
And so Israelites became the term most widely used. But initially, very early on, the word used was Hebrews. And we still have, it's Hebrew language, it hasn't disappeared, but it was a more ancient term for this group of people. So in this class, we're going to be using some of those tools that we learned about in the first and second lessons, specifically literary criticism and historical criticism. We're going to actually put them to work to try to look with literary criticism. We're going to look at the language of certain verses in Exodus. We're going to look at the words used and try to figure out from the language what was going on. And then we're also going to look at historical criticism. We're going to try and look at contemporary documents and see what was going on by using that kind of tool as well. We're trying, to use outside sources and the internal evidence within the text to recreate the context of the writing. So in the Middle East, in the ancient Middle East, I should say, the word Hapiru, or sometimes it was called Habiru, so Hapiru or Habiiu, they were used interchangeably, was a name that was found on across the Middle East, not just in the area of Palestine, Israel, but beyond that, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, on different stone tablets, archaeological finds find this word, right? Uh, Clay tablets, things like that, and it crosses borders and it spans about 1,000 years throughout the second millennium before the Common Era, BCE. It's a loosely defined social class, an inferior social class that's composed of shifting and shifty population elements without secure ties to settled communities. That's the official quote from, I think, Wikipedia or someone. All right. And so it's made up of the following kind of groups of people: outlaws, mercenaries, slaves, indentured servants, refugees that arose from a shifting political landscape. They had in common, well, they were commonly despised or looked down on. And they were usually thought to have brought it on themselves. They were guilty in some way. They had done something wrong, or their gods were inferior and weaker, and they had lost the favor of their gods. It referred to an ethnically diverse people from many different city-states and backgrounds, but they were all united in that were all pushed into extreme circumstances, usually because of the whim of a large imperial nation. What the similarities between these people were that they were bound together because of violence, dispossession, and poverty. They had those things in common. And I don't know, can you name some modern examples of what might be a modern example of that term Hapiru for us? Anyone? Just throw out. There's a million different things you could say. I'm thinking gypsies or tinkers. In England, there would be the tinkers, or
The homeless.
homeless, refugees, undocumented work, people coming in just doing whatever jobs they can find, going under the radar, that sort of group of people, illegal immigrants. There's more derogatory terms like wetbacks, or I don't know, other words. So you can get the idea. It's really a social class, not an ethnic group. So I'm going to share my screen now because I want to just show using a bit of architectural evidence just to prove that I'm not just making this up. Let's have a look. Share screen. Okay. So now I have to figure out what I did with it. Here we are. So can you see that screen? This is from Wikipedia. This is something called the Labaya. Well, it's an Amarna letter. Can you see this thing here? It's a clay tablet that was unearthed, and it's from this guy called Labaya. I'm not sure how you say that, but he was the ruler of Shechem around what it says here in Wikipedia, 1350 BCE. And he was kind of I think he was a kind of a corrupt official, but he sends this letter to the Pharaoh. And I'm going to just read it. It says, "To the king, my lord, and my son, thus Labeo, your servant, and the dirt on which you tread, I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, and my son, 7 times, and 7 times. I've obeyed the orders that the king wrote to me. Who am I that the king should lose his land on account of me? The fact is that I am a loyal servant of the king. I am not a rebel, and I'm not delinquent in duty. I've not held back my payments of tribute. I have not held back anything requested by my commissioner. He denounces me unjustly, but the king, my lord, does not examine my alleged act of rebellion. Moreover, my act of rebellion is this. When I entered Gazru, I kept on saying, everything of mine the king takes, but where is what belongs to Mikilu? I know the actions of Mikilu against me. Moreover, the king wrote for my son. I did not know that my son was consorting with the Hapiru. I hereby hand him over to Adeo, the commissioner. Moreover, however, if the king wrote for my wife, how could I hold her back? How if the king wrote to me, put a bronze dagger into your heart and die, how could I not exclude the order of the king? It doesn't really matter. He's sort of trying to justify something that he probably did wrong. But what he's doing is that he's trying to uh, defend himself to the Pharaoh that his son was consorting with these hired mercenaries among the Hapiru. So that was just one instance where you see the word Hapiru. They're this sort of rebellious, discontented, shifty kind of group of people um, that were seen as troublemakers, basically. That and this is so this was just oops. So that was just one example of where we see that word Hapiru cropping up in the contemporary documents. So in the book of Exodus, well, at the time of the book of Exodus, there were two main powers, and these were Egypt and Mesopotamia. And I'm going to share my screen again, actually. This time I'm going to show you two maps. This was just straight off the internet, and I see that whoever did this map misspelled Mediterranean, so I'm not sure this is great. I wouldn't. But anyway, this is really, I like this because it's very simple and it just shows the two major power bases at that time. Egypt, of course, we know, this is the Nile. And this is Israel here, right? And then there's this other big empire here, Mesopotamia. Well, this is the Fertile Crescent, right? You might hear someone talking about the Fertile Crescent. These are it's called Mesopotamia because Meso means in the middle. Potamia is river. Potamus is river. So like hippopotamus is, hippo is horse and potamus is river, a river horse. That's what hippopotamus, why it's called a hippopotamus. Mesopotamia is in between, middle of the two rivers, middle of the rivers, the river Tigris and Euphrates, these two rivers, which created this incredible fertile land. And this is, if you ever read in the Bible about the exile, for example, there was the Babylonian exile. Babylon is here. Syria, because that comes into the Bible as well, that's here. You ever hear them talking about the Hittites up here? All right, so this is just a little, just situates you, but you can see how whenever there's an empire, the empire is going to be receding or gaining ground. So the Egyptian empire, sometimes it would stop around here and then it would expand up into here. Like on this map, goes right up to here. And other times Mesopotamia would come down, and take over. But the land in the middle was always getting hammered. It was shifting ownership all the time. It was a very turbulent kind of a place to hang out, this area here. So there was always a potential for refugees and people being displaced because they would find favor with one empire and then the other empire would come and take over, and then the people in charge different groups would gain power. And I do have another picture here. Just shows you that area of Mesopotamia is really Iraq and Syria today. just so that you can situate yourself, and you can see how small Israel is
Mhm.
in comparison. Okay, so that's just to get you situated. So in the book of Exodus, uh, there's a couple of terms that are used to this for the group that Moses called out. But there's a term called the mixed multitude that is used often. And we're going to just read that here. So we're going to look at Exodus. If you've got your Bible, Exodus is the second book of the Bible. We're going to go to Exodus 12, verse 38. Does somebody have that? Do they want to just read that verse out loud?
I have it.
Okay, Maggie, go for it.
A
Or
mix.
you can go from 37 if you want.
Okay. The Israelites journeyed from Rasmeses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides little ones. A mixed crowd also went up with them in livestock in great numbers, both flocks and herds.
That's great. That's great. So, I mean, basically, what there's other mentions as apart from this one. It's just one example where it shows that for one thing, there's a huge crowd. There's 600,000 men plus children. I doubt that the Exodus had 600,000 men with children. Just putting it out there right now, but we're going to talk about that next lesson. However, you can see that even in the context of a very romanticized picture of the Exodus here, it's not just the Israelites, not just the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who are called out. There's also accompanying them a mixed multitude. So even in these texts, which are very romanticized and, you know, glorified, it's still a muddy picture. It's not just the Israelites. There's a whole group with them. And there's other references in the Bible where it says that the group that leaves Egypt is a kind of a mixed rabble. And later on, in the Book of Seven Stories, there's a reference to Nehemiah, which is written later. It's written during the time of the exile, and that same word, mixed multitude, which in Hebrew is Rab Ereb, the prophet or the Book of Nehemiah uses the same word because at that time they're really focusing in on doubling down on purity because they don't want the exile. They've just returned from exile and they want to do it right this time. They don't want to upset God. So they're trying to do everything right. And so what they double down on is the whole purity that, it's the rise of the Pharisees at that point. They're trying to protect themselves from God's wrath and being, something terrible happening to them and them being, another exile occurring, right? So they're trying to not upset God in any way, and so they're focusing on doing everything perfectly and purity. And so one thing that Nehemiah in that book, they're saying that the Israelites should separate themselves out from people of mixed descent, and he uses that same word, the Rabbe Reb. So even at that point, there was a mixture of people that only after the exile, really, they started to focus in and hone down on people being of pure racial descent, and they started looking at bloodlines. But before that, it was much muddier. Everybody was just, it was a bit of a mess, a bit of a mess. You didn't know who you were dealing with. Um, so let's just look at one more passage on that theme, and we're going to look at Numbers this time. And Numbers comes after Deuteronomy. Sorry, before Deuteronomy. don't know why I said after. It's after Exodus and Leviticus, and then you're into Numbers. We're looking at Numbers 11, verse 4. And this is just again to show that the people that we're back at the Exodus here, just to show that there's two separate terms being used. And one says the rabble, which is the mixed multitude, that Ereb, the mixed multitude among them had a strong craving, and the Israelites also wept again and said, if only we had meat to eat. So you've got both the Israelites being mentioned and this mixed multitude. So you've got kind of like two things, two terms interchangeably almost, but they don't mean the same thing. The mixed multitude means just a rabble, and the Israelites is the term that came to be used and associated with the people that were led out of Egypt. All right, so now we're going to look at the word Hebrew and Hapiru. So when we're going to look at Genesis now. I know seems a little bitty, and you're going to feel like, why is she focusing in on this? But hopefully it will come clearer. So Genesis 14. So this is one of the stories of Abraham. In fact, this is one of the first mentions of Abraham. We're going to look at Abraham 14, 13 to 16. Does somebody want to read that one? I just to preface this is before Abraham's sees God in the burning bush. So this is just a description of Abraham. Even before he became Abraham, his name was just Abram, okay? So if someone wants to read chapter 14, verses 13 to 16, does somebody want to read that one?
can.
Okay, go for it, Marcy.
Then one who had escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol, and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Is this the right one?
Yep, keep going.
He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and routed them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the goods and also brought back his nephew Lot with his goods and the women and the people.
Okay, so that's Abraham before he meets God, right? So what does he sound like to you? He's described as Abraham the Hebrew.
An outcast? In a way?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's sort of living out by these oaks of Mamre or whatever, out in the semi-desert. He's got this group of people around,
Kind of like a vigilante.
Yeah, exactly. Like a warlord, a local, I don't know, gang lord almost, Somebody's taken his nephew and he rides off like a posse, and in the night, and then he raids he organizes a raid really. Gets his nephew back plus a whole bunch of booty, and makes it back to his acting like one of these somewhat, if you look at the definition of Habiru, it's mercenaries and people living on doing what they have to do to survive. Usually out on the fringes of society. They're not like educated, middle class, kind of what we would call middle class people. They're just out there doing what they need to do to survive. And so Abraham, the Hebrew, and if you think of Hebrew as Habiru, the same root word, which most scholars these days do, you can see he fits the picture, correct? And then we're going to look at another one, this time David, right? We're going to go forward in time to 1 Samuel. If you remember, 1 Samuel is some of the earlier records of the early kingdom. So they're quite old histories. We're going to look at 1 Samuel 22. 1 Samuel 22 and verses 1 to 2. So 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 to 2, and then we're going to shoot forward to 29, verses 1 to 5. Maybe I'll read them just because it's a little bit more complicated. So 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 to 2. David left there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and all his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Those who were with him numbered about 400. So you have the same kind of person there, right? It sounds familiar, similar to Abraham, really, a charismatic leader with gathering people around him. And then in chapter 29, verses 1 to 5. Now, this is another story about David. And this is when David you can almost see him as a mercenary here. So now the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek while the Israelites were encamped by the fountain that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David with his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of the king Saul of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? Since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Send the man back so that he may return to the place that you have assigned to him. He shall not go down with us to battle, or else he may become an adversary to us in the battle. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here?" So anyway, basically what he's saying, if you can see the picture, it's a little confusing sometimes to read these passages out of context, but basically you've got the Philistines facing the Israelites, Saul's army, and David is now actually in the riding with the Philistines. You know, he wants to hire himself as a mercenary to the Philistines against Saul. And the Philistine leader of the Philistines saying, "We can't trust him because, wasn't he a servant of Israel before?" And anyway, and he calls him right at the start. He said, "What are all these Hebrews doing here? What are all these guys?" Before he even realizes who David is and that David is associated with the Israelites, he calls him a Hebrew. And so you've got the idea that the Hebrew is a term of derision that is one of these, what's this, these, this rabble or this untrustworthy mercenaries or whatever they were, So that paints a picture of what we're talking about when we talk about a Hapiru. But interestingly, in the book of Exodus, if we go to Exodus again, and we're going to go to Exodus 3. So normally when we hear about God is the God of Israel, or God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's we're used to and familiar of hearing when we hear God being addressed in the scriptures. But in these early texts, in Exodus 3, verse 18, this is just one example. It says, "They will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us.'" So we got the term, the God of the Hebrews. And there's other examples given in the book in Seven Stories, Exodus 5:3, Exodus 7:16, Exodus 9:1, Exodus 9:13, Exodus 10:3. It's the same term. God, the God of the Hebrews is telling you to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. So we have this term, the God of the Hebrews. So there are people who argue that when the word Hebrew is nothing to do with Habiru, they're trying to figure out a way to make it actually fit with the racial descent, the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, directly linking all the way through right back to Genesis, back to Adam and Eve. And they will say, well, the Hebrew comes from the name in Genesis at chapter 10, verse 25. There's a name of a person called Eber, Eber. And so that's where the word comes from. They're all descendants of Eber. But the trouble with that is the only mention of Eber in the whole of the scriptures is that one verse. It doesn't tell you anything about Eber, why he would be so special and why he would be so, called into prominence, that the whole race would be called after him. So it's a very weak argument. My question is, why would people feel it was so important to argue that the term Hebrew comes from this guy Eber in verse 25 of chapter 10 of Genesis? Why would it be so important to people to claim that? Can you think of a reason?
Was it because they didn't want to be associated with someone of a lower class?
That could be. That's a good point. That is a good point. It could be. It could be. In my mind, I think the main reason is if you read the Bible literally, right? And so remember when we were talking about a literal understanding of the Bible versus more historical critical literary criticism. And if you're reading the Bible fundamentally, so every verse has equal weight, then you're going to try to, then the stories in Genesis are absolutely true. The 7 days occurred on 7 days. Every single thing is accurate and literally true. So because Genesis has this familial biological link, from one generation to the other, ending with Moses, who was part of that racial group, but he was a baby put into bulrushes. That's why he ended up in Egyptian court and became an Egyptian. It was because of that whole Moses in the bulrushes and, his mother saving him by putting him in the river. So that's the link there. Is to sort of prove that every piece of the Bible is absolutely literally true. I think that's the driving force behind the Eber thing. I think that's my take on it anyway. But there's also I think that if you have a group that is set apart like that, it paints God in a different way too, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the lesson, that if God is just calling, initial call is to the dispossessed, the rejected, then you don't have that feeling of that kind of feeling that you can get of that you are belonging to the chosen race, that you're in. So that might be factoring into, there's that piece too. Anyway, moving forward with the lesson. I have to say that most scholars these days do land on the side of the Habiru as the root for the word Hebrew. And it actually helps, like we just showed, that it helps us actually make sense of some of those early stories about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If they fit in with that class of people, then there is no reason to say that those stories can't fit nicely with that idea of Hapiru being this shifting people, especially as we saw that Abraham and David act like Habiru. And there are other ways that other stories where Abraham and also his Isaac and Jacob act like Habiru, desperate kind of people. We're going to look at a couple of those right now. And one is Genesis 12. This is another Abraham story. And this is where Abraham, well, let's read it first, and then you can make up your mind about this. So Genesis 12, verse 10 to 16. This is a story about Abraham and Sarai before they had their names changed to Abraham and Sarah in Egypt. So does somebody want to read 10 through 16 here? I try to get people to read aloud
I can
because
read. I can
I
always
know.
read if nobody
Yeah, okay,
wants
go ahead.
to.
I like people reading. So for one thing, it's a change from my voice, but also it gets you familiar with just reading the text. And sometimes the text is kind of baffling, but the more you read it, and especially read it out loud, it becomes less daunting to you, you know. So anyway, go ahead, Marcy.
Okay. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels.
So basically, what's going on here? What?
He gives his wife up to save his life.
Right, and to get possessions and just get favor from Pharaoh. Basically, he's pimping his wife, right?
Yeah.
And there's another. He does it again. I have to say. I mean, we don't have to read it, but in it's almost the same story over again at chapter 20, 1 to 18. It's the same kind of deal right there. And then if we go forward to chapter 26, 1 to 11, we can just read that one, I guess. This time we're talking about Isaac, I think. Yep. Isaac 1 through 11. So 26, 1 through 11. Somebody want to take that one on?
I would, but my Bible is different. I think I have the
It
wrong.
doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You can read from your text. It's okay.
Okay. There was a famine in the land, distinct from the earlier than one that had occurred in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went down to Amalek, king of the Philistines in Gerar. The Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt, but continue to camp wherever in this land I tell you. Stay in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands in fulfillment of the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and give them all the lands, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. This because Abraham obeyed me, keeping my mandate, my commandments, my ordinances, and my instructions. So Isaac settled in Gerar. When the men of the place asked questions about his wife, he answered, "She is my sister." He was afraid if he called her his wife, the men of the place would kill him on account of Rebecca, since she was very beautiful. But when he had been there for a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, happened to look out of the window, and he was surprised to see Isaac fondling his wife Rebecca. He called for Isaac and said, "She must certainly be your wife. How could you have said she is my sister?" Isaac replied, "I thought I might lose my life on her account." "How could you do this to us?" exclaimed Abimelech. "It would have taken very little for one of the men to lie with your wife, and you would have thus brought guilt upon us." Abimelech therefore gave his warning to all his men. "Anyone who molests this man for his wife shall forthwith be put to death."
So they could see that's the same story, really, not quite the same outcome, but similar story. And these stories preserve the memory of the total insecurity of this group of people, this class of people. So that's why the patriarchs are not. When I said that the patriarch stories in Genesis are kind of semi-legendary, they still preserve the truth of the people, of the origins of the people who were brought out of Egypt into the promised land. When they're thinking about their ancestors, they preserve that element of the insecurity, and probably these stories are based on ancient stories, they're not completely made up. They're but the ones that were preserved in the text as the patriarchal stories in Genesis are the ones that do preserve this aspect that the patriarchs came from this Hapiru class. All right. So yeah,
this
go
is
ahead.
totally kind of an aside or like different from what we're talking about. Maybe you want to save it to address it at the end, but how does this fit in with like the incest that you were talking about, like our view on humanity's view on incest? Like I think it was last week
Yeah.
you were talking about how that changed. So obviously here, like incest is bad.
Yes. Yeah. I think, well, I don't think for the biblical, I mean, I think the modern sensibility towards incest is probably more extreme than it would have been back then when there were smaller groups of people, smaller pools to draw from. But there was still definitely, I mean, there's no incest in these stories as such, but you're talking about, sharing, more free and easy in terms of
Or like,
feeling it was okay to lend out your wife if you have to. I think what the thing with these two stories of the pimping kind of thing, it's not because they felt like that was a good thing to do, but it was that it's a desperation, that they do whatever they have to do to survive.
yeah. I
It's
mean,
like
like
it's like
him recognizing like the way you're touching her, like that's
yeah.
not how you touch your sister.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I think that
Yeah.
they would have that would have been yeah, that would have been same, they wouldn't have
Yeah. Yeah.
tolerated incest in that way. So it would have shocked him. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You're right. You're right. Yeah, it's a good point. But I think for the main takeaway from these stories is that there's sort of a desperation. It's like women in war situations or extreme poverty prostituting themselves because they need to eat. It's not really it's desperation. It's what you need to do to get through to the next day. It's that kind of deal. And of course, women here are the Habiru of the Habiru. You know, if the Habiru are the people with very little, the women are the Habiru of those people. So they have even less rights and less choices. So they would do what the men told them to do because they had very little power. So so when we get to Exodus, if we read Exodus as the God of Moses chooses a group of Habiru to lead out and give the land. And they settle in the land of Israel, but continue to remember their Habiru Hebrew roots. And over time, this kind of becomes routine and then loses the name loses its social connotation, just like the name Smith or Baker or something, was initially ascribed to someone who worked with metals or baked bread, but then just becomes a surname. It doesn't really become associated with somebody doing those tasks. But underneath, if you scrape the surface, underneath the meaning remains of a social class and a God that opted to choose that class to begin his work in history, of redemption in history. And so we're going to finish the Bible readings today before we go into some discussion with Exodus 3, 7 to 9. So if somebody wants to read Exodus 3, 7 through 9. We're going to probably start next lesson, study with this verse or something similar.
I can do it.
Okay, go ahead, Marcy.
Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them.
Okay, so that's one of the passages is the first thing that God does really in this story of redemption is God hears the cry of the people and decides to act. And so he chooses this oppressed. He hears the cry of the oppressed, and that's what calls him into action. So for the rest of the time, I'm just going to ask you some questions and see what you think. If God's people are not exclusively identified with a particular nation or race, does this make a difference to how we understand God's work or God's action with humanity? Like and how does this fit with what Jesus' message, Jesus' gospel message? Has anyone got any thoughts about that?
I think it aligns with Jesus's teaching because God is for everybody. It's not an elite thing. That's how I feel.
Yeah, exactly. So the gospel is good news to the poor, set captives free, the blind will see, the deaf will hear. Good news is proclaimed to the poor, And so if you're talking about a chosen race, or you're talking about the poor and dispossessed as the people who are receiving the message of the gospel, for me, it's a big difference. I feel like I feel so much better that God is calling all those who are broken as his first act, in history, that he decides, he hears the cry of those who are enslaved. And they're not perfect. They're violent, they're messed up, they're rabble, they're looked down on, they're ostracized, they're marginalized, they don't belong. Yet that's the exact group that God chooses to work with. And so that for me, it's a consolation to think of the Exodus experience in those terms, rather than, that select group that are God's, special people, because that means that, as you say, that then the message is not equal to everybody right off the bat, you know. Um, so some of the questions I had, these were to do with belonging and not belonging. So what does this approach to understanding the Exodus experience and the whole Hapiru, what does that mean in terms of national identity and people be belonging and not belonging? I mean, how important is being an American or being British? How important is that for you? And what does that mean for God? I don't know. I mean, I'm just putting it out there. If anyone wants to reflect on that, that human beings are hardwired to want to belong and to associate. I think so. Has anyone?
I think the verse, being in the world but not of the world um really comes to mind with this topic of conversation, because I don't necessarily, obviously I live in America, but I don't identify as my spiritual self doesn't identify as American, you know.
I
If
often
that
think
makes
of
sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
I resonate with that a lot. I mean, I think of that John Lennon, imagine there's no countries,
Yeah.
no religions, nothing that would separate people.
Mhm.
I mean, and then if you think of what's happening now in the Middle East, it's not really a religious war that's going on in Israel, Lebanon, and Gaza. And what we're talking about is this, Zionists. Oh, and Zionists are people. The driving force with Zionism is the land. It's identity with belonging. Who owns the land. It's not really to do with Jews and uh, um, mm, well, for example, if you're talking about Semitism, the Semites are the Arabs, the people who live in Palestine and in the areas around. They're primarily the Semitic people are the Palestinians. So you can't really say that and most of the Jews that reside in Israel right now migrated there from northern Europe after the war. So the conflict that we have currently going on is more to do with nationality and not really to do with religion. And it's good to separate those two things out. So, we're not talking about being against the Jewish faith or, whatever it is. It's not Muslim versus Jewish. We're talking about national politics here.
Mhm.
And I don't think if we talk about God choosing the Habiru, the poor, the oppressed, the dispossessed, as the primary point of connection for the good news. and redemption, then I don't think that God is interested in borders, national borders. It does open up the whole world to that God's grace can fall on anyone. And of course, I live in North America, so we're very rich compared to most people in the world. But even, I mean, I've worked in the city of Syracuse with, HIV for many years in my role as a nurse practitioner. So I've seen poverty within the United States. I've seen people struggling to make it through from one day to the next socially. So there's wherever you go, there is the poor. And there's, of course, Jesus in the Gospels teaches us that we're all poor in some way. There's times in our lives and aspects of our lives that we can resonate with the Hapiru. We're both oppressors and oppressed. I think all of us, we're this combination. And as I said, even among the Hapiru, there's the women and the children who are probably in a worse place generally than the men. So in any situation, we're both oppressors and oppressed.
And I think
But
sometimes the world
yeah,
forgets that God is the creator. God created the universe. We are all children of God. And it goes back to Gerard and humanity and the way human desire works that causes the violence, that causes the Hapiru people, because people want power. They want to try to better their situation at times. And sometimes people forget maybe what struggles they may have had because now they're on the other side. But I think when we think about God, our creator, who is our mother and father and our wisdom, we're all brothers and sisters.
yeah,
And we kind of forget that. And we need to take care of each other and fight for justice. I hate using the word fight, but to make a stand against the violence that's happening against all these people in the world.
mm.
Yeah. Sorry, I feel like I was just
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think that what I like about uh, grounding the ecstasy spirits with the Habiru is it seems there's a seamlessness when it comes to the gospel and Jesus' message that it's the same message, really. I mean, there's no, it just, it's, it just seems to fit seamlessly for me, that there is this, that we're all equal, like you're saying, Maggie, that we're all brothers and sisters, and you don't have to be a bloodline. I mean, we know that in our lives, you can be adopted, whatever. The actual relationships are much stronger than bloodlines.
I think that the teaching of Jesus, talking about loving your enemy gets at the exact heart of what we're talking about, where certain people groups start to think they're better than the other one, and you otherize
Yeah,
these certain people groups. But then if you come back to that teaching of love your enemy, then that debunks the whole thing, that whole dualistic mindset
yeah,
that
yeah,
you're called to. So you've created these enemies, but you're called to spiritually love them. And that's one of the hardest things, I think, to learn how to do. and like one of the highest callings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you, it's so easy to create us and them. I mean, it's our default setting almost. It goes along with Gerard, and the rivalry, object of desire. It all kind of connects. And then scapegoating, if we can create someone who's other, who's the enemy, it's just what we do, and it makes us feel better temporarily, but it doesn't fix the underlying issue, the problem that we have. The only thing that can actually set us free from that is to let go of that, us and them, that enemy. We see people as human beings, and we enter into relationship with them. And by relationship, it doesn't mean you have to like them, but you see them as a fellow human being. You don't demonize them.
Well, I remember.
Then, yeah, go ahead. Then it's sort of it's only that can really break that cycle of and fill that thing inside us that keeps that sacrificial scapegoating mechanism going. We need something more powerful than that. And that scapegoating mechanism we have inside us is very strong. So we need to replace it with something even stronger, which Jesus teaches is love and forgiveness and acceptance and all those things. Okay, go on, Maggie.
That's like when I first went to Would Have Hope and listening to Tony's teachings. It was one of the things that struck me, that helped me, especially when I needed to forgive. I always said for 9/11, the first week, there was two different experiences with 9/11. The first week was no experiencing just like everybody else in the country. Then I got a call from my ex-husband telling me about a good friend of ours who was killed. He was in the Twin Towers. And then my whole world changed, because then I was like, oh my God, I hope he, didn't have a painful, death and such forth. And then I always kept saying, I'll forgive, but I'll never forget. And I'll never forget, like what Tony said. I had to learn how to forgive radically. There's a difference. With Jesus in my heart, I found that I could forgive radically. And that's why I always feel like it's really important about bringing Jesus into my heart, because when I feel like I'm connecting with Jesus, it allows me then to forgive radically. And it's very freeing. And my heart then loved those who unfortunately did the evil, because their souls were hurting in some way. They weren't totally connected with God because there was violence involved.
Right.
It's
And
life.
I mean, I remember something Kat said a few weeks ago in our local community. She said that, if God is in everybody, and we believe that Christ is in everybody, then Christ is in my enemy. And if I hate my enemy, I'm hating Christ, and there's some point your love for Jesus helps you overcome that creating enemies, which is what we do. And when we talk about nations, I mean, nations are nice because you have the sense of everybody coming together, but it is always in opposition to some other group, some other nation, or some other, people who look different, people who sound different, people who do different things. So, but the stories that we're looking at now show that God reaches out to the weak, has an option, for the weak and for the poor, primarily. And that's a consolation because I am that person, you know, I can resonate with that person. And also that's the sort of God I want to believe in, is a God who would do that. And that's the first thing God does in history, or at least that's the first. I'm not saying that God didn't act before that, but that's the first human awareness of God moving in history. Is that that's pretty good. I'm kind of happy about that, because what you do first sort of sets the ball rolling and sets the agenda almost for the rest. And so yeah, I kind of like, I very much like the Hapiru being at this point in the story, you know, right at the very beginning, right at the very heart of it all, is the poor and the oppressed and the dispossessed, the outsider, and those that don't belong. Um,
Okay.
um, that's kind of, I think, I mean, the questions, I think we kind of covered most of the questions I had. I have to say that I'm running out of material here, so we maybe have to stop a little bit early, just, you know, 10 minutes early. But I mean, the questions I had, just to I'll just read them out, and I think we covered most of them, but just to reflect on them this week is, does it matter to you that biblical revelation begins with God's choice of a group of dispossessed rather than a chosen race? And if God's people are not exclusively identified with a particular nation or race, does that make a difference to how we understand God's purpose? And how does this fit in with Jesus' message of the gospel to the poor? How does this relate to the human desire for national identity and towards who does or does not belong? I think we talked about that pretty good. How much does national identity or race or other ways that we define ourselves as to who is in and who is out matter to me personally? And if God's call is to the powerless and the dispossessed, how do I feel about that? You know, for myself, what does the Exodus story tell me about what is important for God or to God? And does God's call to follow him come through my weakness? And have I experienced this? Has there been a time in your life when you have felt an outcast or weaker than you usually are? I mean, we're very good at either projecting our own self-worth or at least faking it in front of other people, perhaps. But I think sometimes the times that we feel closest to God are in our times of weakness, when we are almost more Hapiru than normal. And just as the I think the message, the word of God came to the Hapiru because they were in a place where they were desperate and they needed to hear it, you know. Whereas if you're the Egyptian pharaoh, or you're in the, you know, Mesopotamian hierarchy or whatever, ruling class, you're not going to be in a place where you're open to hearing this message, this word from God. So in a way, I think it had to be the Hapiru that heard God first or connected with God first. And that's true for them, but it's also true in my own life that when I felt weakest and the most powerless, it's at those times that God speaks most powerfully, and I actually can feel closest to God, I think. So I don't know if anyone wants to share anything, or if anything comes to mind of a time in their life when they felt particularly helpless, um, or powerless, and they felt the touch of God. That's Hapiru moment, perhaps. I can tell you, for me personally, there's a time in my life when I felt probably the worst I've ever felt. I won't go into details, but I felt very vulnerable, and uh, it wasn't that my life was kind of falling apart, but it was about as closest to that as I've experienced. And I was lying in bed, feeling totally terrible, awful. And I had my eyes closed, but I felt Jesus in the room with me. I felt Jesus came to me physically in the room. And if I opened my eyes, I would see him in the flesh. It was a powerful experience. I've never had it before or since. And where I've actually felt the physical presence of Jesus. And it was so powerful that I can recall it even now, or whenever I doubt, because everybody doubts, do I really believe in God? Is it real? Am I just deluding myself? Everyone has those kind of moments. And then I think, but remember, Linda, remember that time when Jesus came to you. And it's a powerful experience. And it's the same sort of deal, basically. I felt like if I could just open my eyes, I would just see him right there. I could almost hear him breathing. So, and I could feel he was just an arm stretched away from me. So I want to encourage people that that's the God that's our God, the God of the Hapiru, the God of the weak and the powerless. It's a beautiful thing. So anyway, maybe reflect on that a little bit this week. And next week, what we're going to do is we're going to study the actual story of the Exodus, see where we go with that.